Hello, everyone. We have over 400 guests from over 50 countries joining us today for this masterclass talk from the RCA and Design for Good Academy. Before I introduce you to our esteemed guests, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link to the recording after the event at some point later in the week. We aim to have a very interactive session today, and we invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A button. And please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding the webinar. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ron, Delfina, and Rob. I'm going to hand you over to Delfina, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Joe. I'm pleased to welcome our audience to the second RCA Executive Education Design for Good Masterclass. I am Delfina Fantini van Ditmar, Senior Researcher at the School of Design, and I'm also a co-investigator of Becoming Regenerative, a project dedicating to foster a regenerative design and entrepreneurship landscape by integrating deeper ecological and systemic perspectives.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Rob Phillips. I'm a senior tutor in Design Futures, and I'm also the principal investigator for the Ecological Citizens Network, funded by the UKRI. So our mission is to explore and catalyse ecological citizenship, positive climate action in a sustainable digital society.
Thanks, Rob. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Ron Wakkary. Ron is a professor in the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at Simon Fraser University, where he founded the Everyday Design Studio. He also holds a part-time position as a professor in industrial design at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. Ron's research explored the evolving role of design in multi-species coexistence, both from a material and also a human-computing interaction perspective, aiming to create future design practices that are accountable and supportive of more than human worlds. His recent books, Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds, published by MIT Press, and The Importance of Speculation in Design Research, recently published by Springer Nature, continue to inspire and challenge the design community. As designers, we face the responsibility to nurture care for all living beings and also to create opportunity that enhance ecosystemic health. In today's masterclass, we will be addressing how to acknowledge the interconnectedness of humans and non-humans as a foundation for design. Ron, you have a background in human-computer interaction, and currently you teach in both a Faculty of Interactive Arts and also in industrial design. How did this interest in more than human started?
First of all, thank you, Delfina and Rob, for having me. I really, it's an honor to be part of this masterclass and a part of the Design for Good and RCA X series. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to be here and really looking forward to this discussion. Their question about, how did I get from human-computer interaction to really what I engage in, which is ideas of thinking about more than human. I don't know, I guess in some ways, I think I would blame it on maybe taking human-computer interaction, or HCI, very seriously, or maybe too seriously, in the sense that HCI is about trying to think about this notion of what is to be human and what is computation. And it actually does constantly investigate this question of what it is to be human and what is computation, or what is computing. But also, something really appeals to me, aside from that conceptual level, is it works materially, it works through design, it works technically, it's specific, that one thinks about the interface part. How does one interface between being human and the notions of computing? So that was really fascinating to me. It opens up a whole series of kinds of questions. But I also began to question HCI itself, namely the narrowness of the concerns with just humans, but also this separation of humans and computing. And an interesting way for my guess what just happened was I sort of took the terms, for example, like users quite seriously, like what does use mean, and who uses the things that we design, and the question of, which really broadens to the question of stakeholders, which really gets you to more than human quite quickly. The notion that in the world in which we as design in general, we really, I mean, at its simplest is that we make things of the world or in the world. And in that sense, the who is involved or what are the relations through the things we make, it's actually quite broad. So the question of stakeholders goes well beyond simply being human. And I think, to me, my own work in my research, where I design things to ask kind of questions. They're not the things you would normally design. It's not about designing for functionality necessarily or designing a product. It's actually designing to ask a question. Often, maybe it's conceptual, philosophical, or sometimes it's really quite material. But I design things to ask questions, and I started thinking about the various perspectives from which that we take when we ask these kinds of questions. So some earlier work in the time when people were really concerned about Internet of Things, for example, I'd ask a simple question of what does it mean to be a thing on the internet, as opposed to what do the things do for us, namely us being humans. And it opens up a whole series of interesting questions, and also, in a way, doesn't necessarily seems to distance ourselves from what it is to be human, but actually opens up the question of rather how do we interact with technology, but how do we relate to technology? Or how does technology relate to us? And when, in a more profound sense of understanding design, its role in the world, the way it shapes the world, even the world, our experiences, and not necessarily through direct interaction. We walk into a room, and in fact, in many ways, the ways in which we interact in that room or behave in that room are prefigured already by the ways in which not just we've designed the room, but the things that have been designed in the room, whether they be chair, with furniture, the floor. And in a sense, this kind of sets of relations that determine in large part how we act and who we are. So I think bringing those kind of like going back to the central question, what does it mean to be human? The questions about what the role of computing is, and then really though broadening the notion of stakeholders, and what and who in fact are we designing for, and how do we relate to, and how does this shape our worlds? So that really kind of got me toward the perspective of more than human and kind of critiquing the narrowness, I think, of human-centered design, and I would, human-computer interaction, and I think human-centered design, that I think by the challenges of the omissions that kind of framing creates.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm just going to jump into our next question, which is, there's a couple bounded together, which is, well, it's a complex situation. So what does designing for more than human involve? And are there any examples of positive or negative design practices? And kind of like, what would the skills that we need to relearn or question? And I think that's something, there's then all of this informs what is the potential for design as a practice or industry, but it's a complex question because they're kind of all together. So yeah. If you wouldn't mind chopping them up, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, it is complex. I think there were at least 3 or 4 questions into that one question. But really, I mean, I think they're all in around the kind of same set of issues, and I think it's it is actually, I would suppose, the question that's asked of, if we do make this distinction of more than human, then what does that mean, and what does that require? What does that involve? And there's a number of ways, and first of all, there's a number of interpretations, and there's a number of variations of the term more than human, and it's sort of evolved in practice. And I don't want to get caught up in the semantics of it because I don't think that's that important. But I think people have talked about this in relation in philosophy, for example, and post-humanism. I think there's a real interesting sets of practices developing on the ground around notions of regeneration, for example, and regenerative practices. And I think there's a broader set of ecological concerns, and I think one of the things that they all share, and I think it's central to the notion of what involves more than human, is a foregrounding of notions of relationality. So this idea of interdependence. So I think if you contrast this with sort of humanist notions of thinking, where in fact we tend to think of people and entities as discrete. We're firstly discrete. We do interact with the world, but firstly we are our own entities. And I think in more than human, it's very much thinking that we are so interdependent with the world around us and with others around us. So it's a relational way of thinking. And that's the first thing that it involves. The second is this notion that we are not exceptional in terms of our agencies, and we being humans, that we are open to the notion that there are shared agencies, that others in the world, non-humans, more than humans, have impact, have agentic qualities or effects. Often this is sort of shorthanded as decentering. So this notion that we are, what does it firstly involve? In a sense, is decentering, that is kind of losing our privileged place in the kind of ecological sphere of the world. We're not at the top of the pyramid. That we have to think about what it is to be human, as to be relational with that which is not human, as well as socially in that which is human. So this kind of sense of, in a way, it does lose a sense of exceptionalism and privilege, this centering notion. And so how does one act from a decentered position? How does one act that one has to always think with or feel with? When I, in the book that I read on one human-centered things we could design, the approach I discussed was designing with. So this notion that one simply doesn't just design on their own, and one always designs in relation to others, sort of what I was talking about earlier about this kind of broader set of stakeholders. Are there any examples of positive or negative? I would have to say, firstly, in large part, I think for all of the gains of human-centered design, and I think most of those are social, and I think some sense of progress and built on a kind of, a large, the humanist project of a sense of human progress. I don't think can be denied for some of its gains and benefits, although in large part there's a great degree of omission. And in that sense that most of the practices, because they're centered on the notion of, at the end of the day, how does it serve human values? How does it serve human progress? If there are to be trade-offs in the world, the trade-offs are for us ourselves. And in a sense, we're as we, and of course we are well past knowing the notions of climate change crisis that we are, at least in the age of Anthropocene, or we want to consider it differently as Capitalocene, or however other notions that we have about the era that we're in, that we clearly have an effect on the world that way we didn't even realize. So that interdependency comes back to us quite negatively. And I would say that most of that is shared with much of what we have designed. I have the term that I call more than human biographies, and that is trying to think of the things we designed, not just in the framing of human use and human life, but in the more than human life. So, a classic example is when we work with plastics that can last, and they just basically, as we all well know, they just fragments into small particles. But this could be hundreds of years or thousands of years. That has a more than human temporality to it. And frankly, that's the kind of way in which we have to think. But much of our practices have narrowed it down into just our human use, and so therefore we haven't really seen these. We're now, within the consequences of condition of really more than human conditions. In some sense, it's not seeing the world anew, it's seeing the world the way it has always been. So I think there is a major shift, and I think there have been some really promising approaches, and we'll probably talk about that later. But I think overall that question, but I think the impacts have been for the large part negative. But I do think we also have to think through these questions of what is right and what is wrong, and what are solutions. And I think we have to think more nuanced and things in terms of things on a continuum. There are always trade-offs. I think a world in which we live solely in positive impacts and effects, it just doesn't exist. And I think we can see that when we broaden the world in this kind of more than human framing. So thinking about, so all this is like, okay, well, that's quite large and quite, in some sense, fundamentally different, or is what's involved. So I like to think, if you think about practices and I think about the here and now, I like to think that they're kind of, let's say there's a way in which we could see this as an attitudinal shift in practice. So, for example, one can simply, even within one's own practice, and let's just say very much even a human-centered practice, or one's working in industry, that one can think about. I don't think it's much to ask beyond the temporal span of use. And I think there are life cycle assessments, et cetera, and I think in the sustainable framing, but we can also push this on a more fundamental level of, I think there's a lot to be said about the relationship between sustainability and more than human, but I think the question of sustainability still comes back to very much a human-centered notion of how do we sustain our practices. And I think the call is a little bit more radical than that. And I do think the question then becomes, but attitudinally, one can think about the things that we design in this longer, more than human temporal frame. How does what things continue to exist beyond us? I do think that there's a broadening attitudinal sense of stakeholder involvement. I think we know there's some models, whether it be triple bottom line or whether it be 7 generations of thinking, that I think are readily applicable, at least in an attitudinal sense, to approaching kind of more than human practices. If one really wants to take the leap, and this is the leap into, I think, the unknown, but I think the leap into what is a much longer kind of generation of practice, I think it's really quite a radical change. I think to think through one's own, I mean, just on a human level, think through one's own subjectivity as being interdependent with others, not just other humans, but things that we don't even know about, things that are not human. And then to think about others as having, non-humans as having forms of agency that we're a part of is actually quite a radical shift. But I do think that it is very much possible in practice. It does change, and hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I do think that one has to kind of get that's the possibility to then reframe. I mean, human-centered design is really, we're into 40, 50 years of human-centered design. This is not something which is it's not something that's going to be changed overnight, but also B, if we shift to another way of thinking, that is also not going to happen in a short period of time. That's an ongoing practice. That's a collective, ongoing kind of rethinking of the world and rethinking our place and position as designers.
Thanks, Ron. I mean, I'm really glad you brought the needed radicality of change, and also that you addressed these polytemporalities and going beyond the time of use. In design, this is specifically important, I think, for industry, design practices, but also in education. It really forced us to think differently about design as a field itself. In your answer, you also mentioned regeneration and ecological concerns, in which diversity and also locality are essential notions to be addressed. Mm-hmm. In this context, I'm very interested in hearing more about what are the cultural nuances of more than human that you have observed, read, theorized, and also heard about in your trajectory working in this topic.
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, when you think about, I think the shift in, we're talking about in the radical shift, that I think there's just quite a number of I think ways of thinking through differently. But I do think also there's a difference between radical shift and radical break. So I like that notion of cultural nuance that you bring. I think that is not only just to be more hopeful, but I think also that we're always in an ongoing process of practice and care and an ongoing shift and change. And so I think but I think one of the most, I think particularly for design, I think that's a really interesting, well, it's a nuance, but it's a really quite a fundamental one. And I think it comes back to questions about design and questions about solving. And problem solving, and the notion of what might be a solution. And I think there's a fair amount of sophistication around that idea. Wouldn't want to discredit that, but I do think that there is a necessity to kind of understand. So for example, one of the kind of ways of thinking about what are the outcomes, what are the successes in what we do. And I think some of those successes are not necessarily finding one thing that's different, that's better, and then supersedes the other, but actually working through issues, particularly if anyone's done site-specific work or anyone's done kind of community-based or ecological work, there's all kinds of trade-offs. And there's all kinds of ways of framing and different perspectives of what might be a solution. And in some ways, it's really important to kind of be really situated about that question. So what might be a kind of success notion for, say, one particular, if we talk about this socially, from one group of people to another group of people are very different. And you have these differences that are intact. And one can think about this and what might be what might be a thriving habitat for a particular ecology in relation to another ecology that happen to be cohabiting in the same space. We have differences. So one of the nuances is actually finding ways. I have this notion of, in the book, I talk about it as cohabiting. If there's a goal I would like to see with more than human, is that we better cohabit. And meaning that we better cohabit, the nuance here is that sometimes we do that with differences intact. We don't necessarily try to resolve differences away into a solution. We tend to read how another concept, the notion is the idea of diffraction. It doesn't necessarily get redirected completely into one different direction, but different multiple kind of options or solutions or responses coexist. And in a way, it's this ongoing notion of how do we keep this cohabiting, coexisting of differences intact. It might seem really quite philosophical, but it actually really is quite specific and quite material. One only has to think about, I mean, I'll put this in the most mundane kind of example. One only has to think about going, when you return home, either to your apartment or your home, to your partners or to your family or to your roommates or whomever. And here is a world of cohabiting differences. You know, and in fact, there is much in that. I mean, we can almost ground ourselves in that ways in which we live in our we cohabit and we live in our own spaces, and it shifts the way in which we think about designing, I think, which is not something we haven't paid attention to, which is designing is not a done once and done. You know, it's like I've done my design, I've done my solution, and now I move on. It's not one and done. It's an ongoing practice. It's emergent. It's care. Care becomes a part of that practice. And it's this ongoing management and ongoing care of something, as one even thinks about as one lives in one's own home, is this ongoing practice. And so I think these, you know, are seemingly nuanced and sometimes maybe difficult to grasp, but I think they're quite central and they're quite fundamental to how we kind of I think sort of reveal different ways and opportunities for the way in which we could design.
Wow, thank you. And so our next question, just, you know, out of a lot of the things that you're picking up on that really informs the situation, and I think how things contextually are located are really critical, especially in the work that we're doing in Ecological Citizens. So I think also by this, and in this answer to this question, it's really important that it's from your perspective, and then other people can take what it is from there. It's not just about going right and wrong. It's the way that we see things. Everything is contextual. And I think that's something that's really difficult to unpack. There's some brilliant questions coming in, by the way. Thank you very much for adding them. So within today's culture, we have a digitally connected society. How can we use the modern human in connection to technology as an opportunity to design for practices of ecological citizenship? And sort of like how can that work, or the locations of how that can be seen?
Yeah, great question. And I want to, I don't know if I'll go at it directly. I'm not trying to avoid it, but I'm trying to reframe it a little bit. And I want to come back. So actually, I want to come back to you to the first, when you asked me the question about human-computer interaction. And I think that this, on the one hand, what it opened up by separating, in a way, humans and computing, it opened up a way to kind of focus on what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be what does computing mean, and what the relationship is between the two. But I think in thinking through thinking about us in a more than human world, or in post-humanist terms in particular, let's say if you look at the philosophy and critical post-humanities, or ideas of philosophies of technology. In many ways, yes, we're in a digitally connected society, which in some sense isn't surprising because humans are technological beings. And I think in the sense that we have to be careful, we think about more than human, we want to be careful. It's breaking down binarisms. So in a sense, we don't want to there's a lot of attention to what we might consider nature or other or wild, for example, but the binarism of nature culture, that we are interconnected with this, we co-produce a world around us that's natural, we co-produce a world around us that's technological, and in fact we can't separate these things out. We can't separate ourselves out from the technological question. We can't separate ourselves out from the larger world question. So let's call that nature, for example. And these are bound together. And I think that's what you're kind of asking. You're kind of asking about, we have these digital tools and we have the opportunity to kind of address ecological questions through our relation to or our understanding of digital tools. And I would just shift that we are technological beings firstly. And in that sense, that has a kind of relation to we've always acted in an ecological or in relation to the more than human world as technological beings. It raises all kinds of questions, which I think we have to address. First of all, I think understand how that, as a technological as being technological, how we actually mediate these questions of ecology. So I think it comes back to this. Where do we cohabit? I don't think we can. I think there's to exclude the notion that we can cohabit without technology. And of course, there are others who want to get on rocket ships and go off to Mars, and they want to cohabit without the world that we're in now. And these things are not really. They don't address the real issue that we have, which is the real issue that we have is, in fact, we have to connect AI. We have to connect to resources. We have to connect that every time one does a query on ChatGPT, one consumes I don't know the exact figure, 7 to 10 times the amount of resources if you do a search on Google. The notion of the virtual and the material, the virtual and the world are very much a part of it. So in a way, the question you ask is a kind of fundamental design question, is how does one act as a technological being that cohabits a more than human world or has an ecological framing? And I don't know that, I think that in a way, it guards us against creating tools that we see as separate from us or separate from our ecologies. That's where I think the danger lies. So I think if we have notions, if we think, and so a good example of that, I think that reproduces itself over and over and over and over again, is scale. I think that we feel the sense in designing technologies is that technologies can be scaled freely. And that cost to what it is to be human as technological beings. We know social media has already shown us that that's not the case. You can't scale that kind of connectivity without some cost of what it is to be technological humans in this world. And then also the notion of scale in relation to resource use and resource extraction. And again, I mean, just the sheer scale of AI, which is being the question might not actually be the computation itself. It may be the degree to which we scale it, and I think that becomes the more, to me, interesting question of, I think, for coming back to how we think about our design practices, is to throw some hesitancy into things that we just assume. And one of the things I think we're assuming right now is this question of scale, and to show some caution. I think this is the virtue. I think Delfina was talking about thinking through about how does one design in a very situated way? How does one design and you were talking about things as being context. And how does one design a place? How does one design with that really specific relations in mind? I think is part of the requirement or attitudinal shift that I think we need. And part of the idea of scale is a flattening of relations, or a kind of getting rid of the relations, as if things can just scale up without having any impact as an outcome of scale.
Absolutely. And there are quite a few points. Please keep your questions coming in the chat. It's wonderful to hear so many different approaches, especially internationally, from the backgrounds that we've got coming to discuss with us today. So my next question is, could you tell us a bit more about contemporary disruptors? Because I think this is really interesting. The challenges, the voices, the cultures, the countries, the laws or policies, because what should we be looking from that, from those elements for more than human, that can inspire design practices? Because those parallel examples, we can learn from them.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it. First of all, I think it's really an exciting time. I think there's practices kind of emerging almost everywhere, and one should not think about. I mean, again, and I hope we can, again, this inclusion, breaking down binaries of global South and global North. That I think the kind of ways in which we're thinking about more than human doesn't have the same. The requirements of being innovative in technology in the human-centered sense are skewed to such a Western way of set of requirements and resources and infrastructure. And I think the value of kind of more than human is actually it's leveraging ways of thinking. And for example, we just think about indigenous ways of knowing that have existed for millennia. And I think things that have been pushed to the margins that I think have an opportunity or are of value, of immense value, and not just a value to be the new next universal approach, but a value in its diversity. So value in place. So I think so I guess the question, the answer, I think, and in fact, one of the current research projects I'm doing is actually trying to immerse myself in this and find these kinds of emerging practices and groups that are doing it. But I want to shift in a way to, because I think one of the real, and I'll give you a range of examples, and I think that I think are interesting. Some are really quite known, and actually I find particularly kind of probably. Let me start with a simple one, and one of the reasons why I want to bring this up, because I think there's a notion that what we design needs to be different, and I think that that's fair. But I think the bigger question is how we design needs to be different. How we organized and collectively create the structures to design, I think is really important. And it comes back to questions of relationality. But even one, I think it doesn't really touch on design, but maybe because I'm from Canada, but I'm a big fan of GDPR. I just think that creates a whole fundamental, like on a scale that I can appreciate and I think is valued, a relationship to digital data that I just think has been for far too long. It's just ignored, but it's a relationality. That's what it brings up. It just brings up, it's a question of relationality. And I'm very aware that I'm in a very different data world and internet when I'm in Europe than when I am in Canada. They're completely different places, in large part because of GDPR. But let me give you another more. In my book, I wrote this amazing collective in Yogyakarta in Indonesia called Life Patch. It's the Life Patch Collective. And what I find most interesting is how we, as I said, gather differently to design, and who and what we gather to design. So the Life Patch is I would say they call them a kind of bio collective that is focused in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, focused in around the river, and has a constituent stakeholder in the collective is the river, is the water, and it's a series of activities. And it's a collective of coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, but also a clear reframing they do about how they do practices. They were really seen as a good example of DIY, do-it-yourself practices. They countered that. It's not do-it-yourself, it's do it with others. And so this kind of collective pursuit of do it with others. Let's consider the river. Let's consider the water. Let's consider those who live around the water. Let's consider the soil. Let's consider how my practice as a designer is related to my on the maternal side, my mother and my grandmother and their practices in the village. And all of this is connected. It's a rethinking of who gathers to design. And I think I call this constituency in the book. I just think it's fundamental that we stop and before we even think about what's going to be designed, we think about who we consider and what we consider is important to what we gather and what we include and exclude in terms of what and as the platform by which we design. We can call this a studio. Corporations do this. I want to see alternatives. Like I think Light Patch is a good alternative. Another alternative to that is in the more in the Western European context, it's Jurgen Bai, who used to do Droog design in the Netherlands, and he's running a series with his partner, running a series of what he called water schools, and this is located in different places throughout the world, with the focus of water and water usage as a studio practice. And again, it brings in this larger constituency or collective of centered around kind of more than human thinking and more than human participants, et cetera. Another model, and it's actually a corporate model, and I think it's pretty fascinating, and it's Patagonia. I don't know if anyone is aware of Patagonia as a clothing company, and actually was fascinating. So they do kind of outdoor clothing, climbing, clothing, et cetera. I've always had this kind of environmental forward kind of approach, giving a certain amount of proceeds to different groups. And recently, the founder, Yves Chenard, he simply said, listen, I never wanted to be a company. I'm a designer. I wanted to make things. And they were looking around for new models for Patagonia and have shifted to the point where now Patagonia is, in essence, through a trust, is owned by the earth. It's not a corporate entity in the same sense. It's shifted its sense of stakeholder involvement. It's still going to produce things in ecological and sustainable ways, but all proceeds, all the profits, all capital goes toward kind of, in their sense, stewardship. And there's some issues there, but nevertheless, this way of kind of returning to this, returning to the planet that we live in. And I think it's a sense of kind of cohabiting, which is fundamental. Scaling up a notion of citizenship as a corporate citizen, rethinking what it means to be a corporate citizen, and then rethinking who, in fact, you are cohabiting the world with and where the benefits should be distributed. And that is a platform. That's a platform for making goods. That's a platform for designing. That's a platform, and I think these are the questions that I think where I would like to see a lot more invention happen is how we organize the design.
Many thanks, Ron, for this insightful conversation where care, relationality, collective organization, decentralization, situatedness, diversity, enhancement of living principles are essential aspects of what we should be hesitant about current affair in industrial design, as it has been at least in the 100 years. I will move now into the Q&A. We have a very vibrant audience here. So the first question is from Lizzie Shupak. Can you talk a little bit more about consent in the context of human and more than human design research? In the already complicated dynamic between designer, researcher, and their human design goal research subject, how does more than human co-design stay consensual?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I don't know that, I mean, I do think, and again, I think you raised a very valid point that even in the case of doing research that involves humans or human subjects in the language of ethics and research, has all kinds of issues about what do we actually mean by consent, and when does someone consent, and what are they consenting to? And in large part, at the center of that question is an asymmetry of knowing and an asymmetry of practice. In other words, the researcher has some level of knowledge that the participant doesn't. The researcher is in some level of agency over the practice that the participant does not. And that clearly extends to the more than human world. And I think it's fascinating, this question. I mean, there's that in legal terms, I think this notion of granting non-human entities personhood. So, for example, rivers have legal standing. I mean, this has been now and in New Zealand. I think recently there was a river in Quebec that was given legal personhood, which allows it to have legal representation in the court system. It's actually fairly limited. I mean, the sad truth is corporations have had legal personhood since going back, I don't know how long, I mean, quite a long time. So this non-entities having legal personhood is kind of legal representation, and that question of consent. But here I think is so I think that there's a couple of, it's nested in a bunch of questions. And also, how does one represent entities that are not human in essentially a human enterprise? Even if we're talking about more than human design, we're talking about a human enterprise. And I think it's a question, I talk about this, I use a term, it's called the speaking subject. It's our role as human designers in a gathering of more than humans. And how does one speak on behalf? And I think one cannot make the assumption that one has consent. And so one has, but yet that doesn't necessarily relinquish one from including and eliciting participation of more than human actors in the things that we design, and the need for more than human actors to be represented. So this goes back to that nuance question where I don't think we can sign off on a form. We can't have the resolution. And I do think it means changing our practice, that I do think is a level of caution and humility, and a question of acting, with that sense that one has both the privilege and the risk of participating with things that are not human. So I don't think we can resolve the question of consent so easily. But I don't think that gets us away from not including and not being aware and not thinking relationally.
Thanks, Ron. The next question is from Lauren Davis, who is interested in your view on how more than humans can have a genuine voice for their needs, desires, and concern through designs that impact them in a way that is related to the previous question. So Lauren addressed, do we risk projecting or anthropomorphizing this by following our original design approaches and systems? So yeah, perhaps if you have any example where this co-design process goes taking into account other species, I think that could be a really nice thing to address back with an example.
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think one of the first of all, so I do think that that's an area of real. So we can shift, I think, our understanding of methods in design towards this understanding relations, and so I think we have there's. And I think this is where a lot of really good and vibrant research is happening around questions of noticing, questions of attuning, questions of designing with, and I think firstly is the shift to thinking about where our attention needs to be, understanding the relation the relations that we have. So it's not necessarily fully we can never fully understand. It's hard enough to fully understand another human, let alone understand things that are not human. And I think there's also just there's an anthropocentric limit. The ways we are fundamental. I mean, obviously we are human, and there's an inherent limitation to our ability to understand bacteria, other than in very reductivist kind of natural science approaches, which is not to rule it out, but there is more than, if you think about it in relational terms, there is more to that relation than understanding what exactly that entity is. To me, so again, I think that noticing is one of many examples, but noticing is one that I think has been used a lot, and I think there's a really good example in Anna Singh's Mushrooms at the End of the World, where I think if you look to the specific example where noticing is the focus of understanding the relationship of the Mitsutake mushroom to the pine trees and to the environment, the soil, and the ground cover of the forest and the forager. So really what we're now talking about is noticing within those set of relations. And in a very specific sense is first, and another actually noticing is attuning to and learning that environment. The geographer Jamie Lorimer has a really wonderful term. It's called learning to be affected. And it's used for those who are, for example, in conservation, that if you're focusing on a particular species, it takes time. One has to put in the work and the practice to attend to and understand habitats, the relations of habitats, the relations of species, et cetera. Going back to Anna Singh, it is really her I guess, protagonist in the notion of the idea of noticing is the forager. And the foragers being in the landscape and understanding the shifts and the differences within the landscape and learning and seeing there's a very particular relation that Mitsutake mushrooms have to the roots of pine trees. And that's where they not only are, but there's a certain disturbance of the land, if one wants to call it that, or lack of disturbance. And so really, I think the question comes down to thinking relationally and focusing on relations, not entities. And yes, and then there's the question of anthropomorphizing, and absolutely, that's an incredible. I mean, we have a long history, going down to just turning animals into cartoon characters that talk. But I do think, but then I wouldn't totally. The anthropomorphism. There is a kind of almost a staging point. There's a starting point where one tries to kind of relate through one's own means of understanding the world. But then quickly, I don't think that in itself should be totally ruled out, because the opposite is really quite hard. But it also shows the real limitations of empathy. I actually don't think empathy is something that is so central to human-centered design, is actually so problematic and more than human. Because we simply can't empathize with something that is not like us. And the notion of empathy filters or skews toward creating relations only with things that are like us, or things that which is why we might, like we like panda bears, we don't really care about bamboo, those sorts of relations. But anyway, that's what I would say is that I think there's some really. That is one area, at least in more than human design, this question of how one relates and brings that into a design process. I call repertoires, to make a distinction with methods. And I think though to think about these ideas of noticing and attuning, and doing this in a decentered relational way, but understand it's a practice and it's a learning, and it's a learning to be. I like about the Jamie Lorimer's notion of learning to be affected. It brings in the question of affect and emotion. And I think that one has a kind of emotive relation to the world. And if one thinks about cohabiting, one valence that one really wants to pay attention to is what their emotional sense of being and others are in understanding the world, which is often, it actually sometimes more reliable than simply reasoning.
Thanks, Ron. I mean, I really echo with your view, and thanks also for bringing Anna Singh and this notion of noticing and attuning in terms of design is such an important process that takes time and it requires a deep engagement. So yeah, I think that's a key thing, and building on this idea of the non-anthropomized version, or the non-cartoonish speaking in a human way for others and thinking they're collaborating because they're never accepting to kind of work with us. I think a really interesting example is the work of Julia Lohmann. She's an RCA graduate now. She's a professor at Aalto University, and she works with algae. So something very important working with algae is understand the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Where when the ecosystem is really flourishing, and in that way, it's not about anthropomizing one algae, but it's really understanding how that whole ecosystem is being built. And it's not about being happy or being in a positive side, but it is about how it is creating a fertile place for other species to thrive and flourish. So I think that's a way in which design then stops being this anthropomized, cartoonish, but actually, when thought through, it can have an incredible ecological impact through thinking, as you were pointing out, these relations that the designers, through this attuning and noticing, can actually create a significant difference. And an outcome of this is a designer not just engaging with a biomaterial like algae because algae is better than plastic, but actually that algae in that region, that algae not being harvested, but that algae being cultivated with perhaps the help of some ecologists that understand these balances, because the designers can create catastrophic environments.
Yes.
So then it, to me, started getting really interesting and valuable. So yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, I think one of the sort of metaphors I hold on to, or term I use, is horizontality. I think we tend to think we privilege verticality, and that does, and I think it's that kind of ability to have as much of the horizon available to us at any given time. But also, it has a bit of a danger around world building, that we tend to hold an omniscient view of things, particularly that are that scale affords. The idea of horizontality is to kind of think opposite, to lie down, literally, just to if one create multiple points of contact with the more than human world. They're also multisensory. So I think if one can think about a situation and think about what is a horizontal relationship to that, and it's also grounding. And in some sense, I think we also, to decenter ourselves, but also gives us some insight, is to lose our grasp on the horizon. Is actually it actually provides a lot of insight, but I think it also puts us in a position of lesser, I guess, privilege, but I think it shows us we're much more operating in a relational world, much like things that are not human. And so I think this question of horizontality, and I think it could be metaphoric. I think I've been doing work now where I'm doing work. Well, I guess I've been working with pollination ecologies and designing relational technologies, pollination ecologies. And over time, over seasons, and noticing things that we make and wanting to see how they decompose, and I spend a lot of my time crawling on the ground, looking and finding parts that that we designed to see what happens to them. And I think that's it gives me a really for a moment a glimpse into this relational world that I'm trying to be a part of.
Absolutely. I think it's also, I think the interesting, going back a few steps, I think there's a really interesting challenge with the legal personhood of kind of like how we've had to go, right, because so many people are exploiting things, we've had to put it in a position where it can be safeguarded. And it's a really, quite often how more than human is talked about or discussed is kind of like, right, which material should we use? Why should we do that? Rather than a difference in kind of, actually, we are part of nature and how that works. We are part of the natural world. We are from it. It's not an external thing. It's something, and I find it still insane in this country that people aren't given a formal training when they're children, and a lifelong learning into how we're actually looking after the biosphere that also, provides life, which is insane when you put it like that. So I'm going to pick up on one of the questions before we start to wrap up. And I'm going to adapt a question from Tanashuri. I hope that's okay, which is kind of, what are the barriers to entry for designing for more than human? And kind of, because I think and there's a few others I'm just picking up on these things in the corporate world. First of all, it's really difficult to design for a world for more than human in a capitalist society. We need to look at other economics and other means. And so kind of what are the barriers to entry for designing in more than human worlds, and kind of how should we be looking, like what thing can then shift and open up more opportunities, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, first of all, I think there's a lot of barriers. I mean, because I think we are talking about some set of fundamental assumptions that certain systems have been built on that are different than the assumptions we are talking about now. I think is one way to think about that. I mean, we can't think of things as being ideology free, and nothing is ideology free. So everything has its set of assumptions. Although, but and I actually am an optimist. I am pretty convinced of that. And two things I would say about that is that first of all, I think we need to put this, and I said it earlier, we need to put this on a reasonable time frame. And I think change, and I think this idea shifts over a certain time frame. And I think rather than looking for the spectacular solutions, and I think it's an ongoing collective practice, as I've already hinted at. But I do think, of course, we have urgencies. Climate crisis is an urgency in which, and again, this is a classic example of a more than human temporality that is not in our control. And that does create these kinds of urgencies that say, okay, well, this, and I think this is, I think part of the resonance about more than human, people thinking about this in relation to design, is it's connecting the ways of day-to-day practice with the urgencies they feel when they go home and see their families about what needs, and how do I connect my practices together? You know, I think, this is beyond my expertise, but I do think the kind of notion, there's certainly enough change. Conditions are changing and have changed, and understanding of the conditions have changed. To be a corporate citizen or to be an industrial citizen in this world, and there is no greater debate, to be honest, about different ways of practicing, whether that simply be moving away from fossil fuels. If you think about the shifts going on in energy right now, and you think about in many of those shifts, they're far more relational than they are extractive. And not that we'll ever get rid of being extractive, simply be on this planet. By virtue of that, by living on this planet, on some level, we are extractive. But I do think that there are these kinds of conditions and this battle going about what does it mean? And I think more so, and this will come and it will go, of course, with various elections and various shifts in worldviews. But I do think that the conditions, the sheer presence of the more than human world sets a condition by which we have to adapt to and cohabit. Whether we can do this within the time frame of the urgencies of climate crisis is really a large debate and a question. But yeah, I do think on the corporate world, I do think that there are I think Patagonia is, just by virtue of it, as an example. You know, I don't think that, I mean, you know, independent, we have good and bad actors independent of what allegiances they have to capitalism or not. And so I do think, but one of the bigger challenges around that, it comes back to scale. And I just do think an intense critique and understanding of how we think about and leverage scale, and what the consequences of that are, and how scale is used as something to counter change. And how change has to also not just be seen as something that can scale up, but can maybe seen in diversity. And so I think different models of coexisting in the world that include financial and economic are definitely part of it. And there are different ways of kind of forming oneself as a corporation to sustain oneself economically. And it just may not be at the scale that we are used to.
Thanks, Ron. I'm gonna maybe compile a couple of different questions, but one is coming from Michaela Emch. What is the place of ethics in the fields of more than human? And then I'm gonna combine two questions, one from Victoria Guinea. Should more than human ecosystem be understood as integral stakeholders? And then there's a question from Nia in terms of how can we accurately interpret the needs and agency, for example, lands and river, without this anthropomorphizing trend. So if it comes to the integration of more than human in stakeholders, what would be your view in terms of an appropriate space for them, for example, that you might share with us?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I think it's so I'll come to it from my practice as a designer, because I think that it requires that kind of concrete materiality and specificity. So if I think about my practice and my the term I like to use is gather. What is what is the gathering that forms in order for a practice to occur? And I know, I'm institutional, university bound. I know the kinds of things that have been determined about what I can have as a gathering to do research, a lab, certain funding, technology, has to be institutionally bound, has to be within the building, that I can rethink that gathering. And I have. And the practice now, part of why I'm at Eindhoven is to actually break out of the single institutional boundaries that I have. It's also to think where the places are that occur. Much of our work is happening very much not within the institution and happens out of doors, for example. And so it changes the who participates and what gathers. And I think it's partly a role that one has to be, and this is the politics of it and the ethics of it. And we already raised the question of consent. But I do think that there is this ongoing question about one engages in, if one is talking about gathering, one engages in political, it's a political question of politics are always there with collective, and they're there with modes of representation. And I think we have to put that's not something we're going to resolve or something that's going to go away. In fact, I think we have to put that at the center of our practice. And so the center of the practice is if one gathers that which they cannot fully represent or does not fully understand their agency or what they're, one does that with a level of caution and humility. I don't think we don't have any other choice. I think one has to constantly ask the question through actions, what role do I have vis-a-vis this relationship to, this particular entity or this what I'm working with? How do I act with levels of humility? How do I slow down my time so I can attune, so I can notice, so I can listen, so I can see, so I can feel? How do I do that in a way where it's not about, it's not in that accelerated fashion? There's a philosopher, French philosopher, Isabelle Stengers, and she talks about the question of cosmopolitics and talks about the idea of slow science. And the question of that, we don't always know, we never fully know, and our risk to rush to instrumentalize what we don't fully know, and our risk to universalize what we don't fully know. We're in a position where we can't fully know, but maybe that's a question of not assuming that that is the universal. That is something that works with some level of caution in the particular situation that you're in, that allows the temporalities to unfold so you can kind of attune. And it may not seem very practical, but actually I would argue it's very consequential. I think being practical for expediency, well, is exactly that. the expediency of it will come back in consequential ways. And so coming back to the questions of the urgencies of things and temporal timelines we don't control, like climate crisis, we don't really have much. We actually can't afford a lot of the practical expediencies that we've already accrued a lot of benefits through that we're paying the price for, that we can leverage in ways that are better. So I think that I'm hoping that kind of, I don't know if I missed one of those three questions that you asked, Delfina. I do think that it's integral. I do think that anthropomorphism might be an early point of entry that needs to be abandoned, but not totally just forsaken, because I think it's just, again, operating within the limits of being human. But I do think it's in around understanding, it's shifting the framing of temporality, the framing of the ambitions, the shift of attention to the relations. And I think it's understanding that it's an ongoing, there's a term in posthumanism, the questions of emergence and immanence, things are always unfolding. And it's just the case. It's an ongoing process. And that's why I came back to about design has to shift toward not being one and done, but this ongoing care relations. We have a history from participatory design. Participatory design has shown us from that we can operate over longer timeframes. Co-designing is an ongoing process.
Thanks so much, Ron, for this very insightful masterclass, and also Rob for your great questions and connecting us also for this idea of ecological citizenship. I really like this final point you made, Ron, about shifting framings and that design should act upon. You mentioned Isabel Stenger and slow science that we don't fully know, and that also can be very well connected with Donna Haraway and this idea of staying with the trouble. Mm-hmm. And this notion that it's a trackless territory. If you think you're going to find a toolkit and we can solve it all, that's really not the case. Right. But we do have to offer alternatives, and as designers, with, as you point out, care, attunement, humility, and generosity, there's so many things that could be done. So I really want to finish this masterclass in that very, hopeful message that you gave us today. So thank you very much, Rob and Ron, and all the audience for being extremely active today with very good questions. I'll pass it on now to Joe, who will make the announcement of the next masterclass.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Ron, Delfina, and Rob, for sharing your insights and expertise. I would like to thank the RCA and Design for Good Academy for hosting this series of free masterclasses, and of course, everyone in our audience who joined us today for today's talk. The next free webinar talk in this series is scheduled for the 12th of February with Jimena O'Reilly, who is the Global Head of Design at Nestle, in conversation with Timan Evans from General Mills and Mauro Porcini from PepsiCo. We will share a link to the recording of this session with everyone who registered for the event later this week. And thank you again for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.